Hello and welcome back to the Bio 122 videos. Dr. Mark Jackson. This is the second video from chapter 33 on the animal body. And video 10 is going to cover the different animal tissues. So one of the things, just to recall from the previous chapter, is about the evolution of animals in the phylogenetic tree. And we've learned that we have eumetazoa, which is all the animals that have distinct and defining tissues. That's different from the parazoa, which literally means the near animals like sponges, the simplest animals that actually do not have defined tissues and organs. They they do actually, therefore, have kind of the ability to disaggregate, so they can break apart and then reaggregate. The eumetazoa, the tissues that we're talking about, are the adult tissues. So we're not talking about the endoderm, mesoderm, and the ectoderm that we were talking about when we were discussing embryologic development. This is the final tissues that they turn into. And these make up all the different organs of the body. And therefore, they now have an irreversible differentiation of their cell type. So the different tissues we're going to talk about with animals are epithelial and connective, which versions of those are also seen in plants and in fungi. But the two that are unique to animals are muscle and nervous tissue. So let's start with epithelial tissue. And this is the tissue that, first of all, covers the entire outside of the body, but it also provides the lining for the body cavities, the coelom, and the edges of all organs. So it's not, and so often people might confuse this with skin. Skin is actually an organ in itself. This is one type of tissue, and the tissue is a bunch of cells that have a similar function that are grouped together. Let's look at the different types of epithelial tissue in this picture. They're also functionally associated with specific organs based on their form, based on their function, and the laws of physics and what we're trying to do with that organ. We're going to go through each of these individually, but we can see here we have what's called stratified squamous epithelium, pseudostratified columnar, simple squamous epithelium, simple columnar epithelium, and cuboidal. So all of these are epithelium, but we have a couple of different words here. So there's stratified versus simple, and there is squamous versus columnar and cuboidal, because those are describing a particular shape of the individual cells. So let's step through this. First of all, just in general, epithelial tissue forms the lining of the body, and the purpose is to protect the body in most cases. Therefore, in most cases, the cells are very closely packed together and they are connected together by desmosomes, which are protein fibers that bind them together. When we look at an epithelial tissue, one thing that's noted about them is they actually don't have blood vessels. The blood vessels lie in the tissue, the connective tissue that's below the epithelial tissue. So it also means epithelial tissue is always going to be fairly few layers, because all nutrients have to get to them through diffusion from a blood vessel. Therefore, they're not going to be very thick. We also usually have a layer called the basement membrane, which is secreted from these epithelial cells, that is another set of proteins and carbohydrates. Now, proteins and carbohydrates are organic molecules. These are not cells, they are the molecules by which cells are made from, but it's going to form kind of an adhesive that will attach the epithelial tissue to the underlying tissues. The characteristic of epithelial tissue is, well, they rapidly undergo mitosis because they are exposed to the outer environment, whether that be the outer world out here, but also the internal body cavities and the linings of organs. They are subjected to mechanical stress and therefore get damaged quite often. So these type of cells regularly undergo mitosis and cell division to repair themselves. Because of the rapid mitosis, this is also a common place for mutations to occur, leading to cancers. So very often the cancer in a tissue is related to the epithelial cells that are making up that tissue, just because of the rapidity by which they are going to be undergoing cell division. We have several different linings and several different membranes, all of those depending on the particular function of the tissue in that location in the body, and also the type and thickness of the cell. So let's look at a couple of examples here of what's referred to as simple. So 3 different types of simple: simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. So let's start with the term simple, and that just simply means there's only one cell of layers above the basement membrane. Squamous is a word that means flat. If we look at simple squamous epithelial, we see that each of these represents a single cell. The big black dot is the nucleus, and then you see the cell membrane. These are very, very flat cells. They have a particular advantage in certain situations, that if you want to diffuse something across them, this ends up being the best way to get just diffusion of everything. Because look at all this surface area, and then also look at how thin it is between this area, which is the outside world, and then the basement membrane represents the beginning of the body itself. If we want to readily diffuse substances, this is exactly the type of epithelial tissue we want, called simple squamous epithelium. This is what we're going to see in the lungs, for instance, where we have exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Only one cell layer thick. This is also what we're going to see in the blood capillaries, where all the nutrients and all the waste materials are passing back and forth between the blood and the body tissues. So remember that for simple squamous epithelial. We also have a form that's called cuboidal, and cuboidal means a cube. So this is pretty much the same dimension vertically as horizontal, and again, it has a nucleus in the middle. They will be attached to each other and also to a cell basement membrane. And these type of cells are going to be found preferentially anytime you have a tube where you are producing materials to be secreted. Think a pore, a sweat pore, or also the ducts in the kidney. This is where you're going to find cuboidal cells. They will usually form a tube, so hollow in the middle. Finally, we have another layer of single cells, but these are exactly the opposite of what we see in the squamous. Instead of being very short but very wide, columnar cells are like a column in a building. They are very, very narrow, but very, very tall, but still one cell. This is what we're going to see in the small intestine. It's still only one layer of cells thick. That's why it's called simple. So if we were to have something diffusing across the membrane, um, it would only have to pass through one cell. So this is perfect for allowing nutrients to pass into the body in the small intestine. But we have a problem in the small intestine in that we want to control our diffusion because there's probably going to be a lot of bacteria, a lot of other things, toxins that we don't want in. So we want to have a controlled diffusion. If it was very flat, like we find in the lungs, we don't have it's going to just diffuse without much control. But what we do in a columnar cell, we use proteins to selectively transport nutrients. So there will be a transporter for amino acids, a transporter for glucose, a transporter for each of the vitamins, so that in order to get all the way across this cell, you're going to have help from a protein. And we select bad things so that it's unlikely for them to be passing all the way through this long distance. Each of these have their particular place in the body, and each have their, therefore, advantages and disadvantages. So again, here is an example of simple cuboidal, and a good place that you should remember where you can find these is in the kidneys. The ducts of saliva glands, the kidney tubules would be some good examples. The lungs, the final point where the exchange of oxygen is going to occur is simple squamous. We also have a special type of columnar cell that's going to be found in a very specific part of the body. Now, we have simple ciliated columnar. We also have simple columnar with microvilli. The microvilli are very, very small hills and valleys that I showed you in the previous lecture of how we increase surface area in the small intestine. So simple columnar cells are found in the small intestine, but very specifically, they will be simple columnar with microvilli, which are actually just small hills to increase the surface area. Compare that with another type of simple columnar cells, but instead of being with microvilli, they are ciliated, much like the cilia that would be found on a protist. The cilia is fine hairs that come off, and they will often be interspersed with what's called goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus. The cilia are designed to wave back and forth and trap particles as they pass by. Where are you going to see the simple ciliated columnar? Is in the bronchial tubes on the way to the lungs, because these are going to trap particles in the air. And in combination with the mucus being formed from goblet cells, they will be able to trap most particles and remove it from the airways so that they don't get all the way down to the end of the lungs. When we talk about the respiratory system, I'll remind you of why that's important. But the short answer to that is because the end of the lungs is simple squamous epithelial, and it's very fragile. The only thing we want to get into the alveoli to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide is oxygen, nothing else. No smoke, no particles, no pollen. The other place you're going to find simple ciliated, for instance, is in the fallopian tubes, because here it's not about absorption, but here we actually have the ability for these to move the zygotes, the developing new individual, the 2-cell stage, the 4-cell stage, up to the blastula. This is how it's going to move along the fallopian tubes to the uterus to potentially implant and then start to the process of gastrulation. So each of these have their specific roles in the body. If we look at another type of tissue that's called pseudostratified. So you remember the pseudocellumates instead of the acellamates and the cellamates, the pseudocellumates, pseudo means false body cavity or false cellulite. Here, again, the word pseudo means false, but it's talking about a false stratified. So I'm going to come back to this because first I want to talk about what stratified means. Oh, I actually don't have a picture of that. So I need to go back to the beginning. So, because we only have one case of stratified. Everything else we've talked about is simple, meaning only one layer of cells. Stratified simply means multiple layers of cells. Strata. So where are we going to see stratified? This is going to be impervious to diffusion. We want to put a whole bunch of cells there so that nothing comes through because it would have to pass through so many layers. It's also going to be protective. So any place that we're going to have a lot of friction, a lot of damaging things potentially happening, we want to have stratified squamous epithelial. And we remember these cells are repairing themselves all the time. So the ones towards the basement membrane are undergoing cell division constantly, and the ones on the outermost part may well be dead at the time and are sloughing off. A good location that we might see these would be the lining of the mouth, where you got so many things that are potentially going to damage it. But the only thing we're trying to do in the mouth is ingest things. We're not trying to absorb it. So this is where you're going to find that. Now that we know what stratified means, that's going to help us understand what pseudostratified is. It means it's got fake layers. You go back to this picture of pseudostratified, because if we only look at where the cell nuclei lie, the cell nuclei look like, if you were looking at it in a microscope kind of from a distance, it kind of looks like there's a whole bunch of different layers because the nuclei are not lined up. Compare that to a typical simple tissue where all the nuclei are exactly in a line. If we look at the stratified tissue, notice that there's going to be nuclei in multiple lines, which is how we know it's got multiple layers of cells. But the pseudostratified is called that simply because it looks like where the nuclei are that it's multiple layers, but it's actually just one cell layer thick. They're just different heights. Where are we going to see these? These are in particular some of the tubes of the respiratory system. I already mentioned the ciliated columnar cells. This is exactly what I was talking about then, but this is just specifying they also happen to be different heights, which makes it even more efficient in trapping particles like smoke particles, pollen, things like that can fall down and be trapped. And then the mucus gets on them and then you can cough them out. That's what happens in a sneeze. That's what happens in a cough. All of this makes it much more efficient at trapping things so it doesn't get deep into the lungs. So this is not different from the ciliated columnar here. It's just making it more detailed. So simple ciliated columnar and the pseudostratified are the same thing. Okay. We also have one other type of epithelial tissue. In this case, it's striated, but it's called transitional because this has the ability to really expand. it can be stretched very easily while not separating the cells. So it's got a lot of elastic properties. This is the type of epithelial cell tissue that lines, for instance, the urinary bladder, because as you realize, the bladder has to expand as it fills with urine, and then it becomes smaller as you urinate. And so therefore, the bladder has to be very flexible. That's where you're going to find it. So you're going to find it only in the urinary bladder and the ureter that's going to be carrying urine from the kidneys to the bladder. That's the only place you're going to see it. So that's kind of important to keep track of, because anytime you see a unique feature like this, that's pretty easy to mark that down in your memory and say, okay, that's something that's really different. All right. So let's now extend into connective tissues. And we have 6 different major connective tissues. We're going to study these a bit more in laboratory, but let me just go through a brief summary of it. Now, what is a connective tissue? All connective tissues do a similar thing. They support different body functions. So they have a supportive role. But the other feature about them is that it's all composed of individual cells, but instead of being closely packed together like epithelial tissue is, these have a matrix of non-living material, proteins and carbohydrates, fibroblast, that surround the individual cells. So there's a bit of a gap, and that provides strength or flexibility depending on the function of that tissue. And this is how we differentiate these different connective tissues, is the content of the matrix. The matrix is another word that we use for that. Also, ground substance is a word that we use for that. And the ground substance is a combination of collagen, which is a type of protein, elastin is a type of protein, and reticular fibers. All of those are types of proteins that are produced and secreted by the cells of this tissue, and they're used to bind everything together. So let's start with one of the first types, being loose connective tissue. The kind of purple things here are the actual living cells. They are called fibroblasts because they are producing fibers. Fibers are long chains of proteins. The word blast means making. So a fibroblast makes new chains of fibers. There are 2 types of fibers shown here, a very, very thick one called collagen. This is a type of protein that's unique to animals, only found in animals, it's not found in plants or fungi. And it binds the tissues together. And notice how much larger these protein fibers are than the cells. So even though an individual protein molecule is very, very small, this is an enormous number of proteins that are bound together, actually much larger than the cell that made it. Collagen fibers are very strong. So this would be used when you almost like a rope type structure to tie things together. The other type of fiber shown here, the much thinner ones, are called elastin fibers. Think of the word elastic, like a rubber band. So these are also long proteins, much larger than the cell that made them, but they have expansion and retraction capability. Therefore, we can control the physical properties of these tissues, these connective tissues, by regulating the ratio of collagen fiber to elastin fiber. Loose tissue has a bit more elastin fiber than collagen fiber. Where are we going to find this? It's going to be holding your internal organs in the place, and also just underneath the basement membrane of the epithelial cells, and kind of binds everything together. By far, this is the most common type of connective tissue found in vertebrates. And of course, we are vertebrates. The other type is called dense connective tissue. Fibrous is another word for that. And these have a much higher percentage of collagen in general, but they also have elastin fibers, just like the loose, but it's going to be leaning towards collagen. And another distinction is if we looked at the loose connective tissue, the arrangement of the collagen fibers is going in all different directions. It's three-dimensional. Fibrous or dense connective tissue has all the collagen fibers pretty much arranged parallel to each other. So this functions like a very, very sturdy rope or chain. So that gives you some indication of what this is going to be used for. It's going to be used for the tendons that attach your skeletal muscles to the bones. Also the ligaments that connect the two bones together at joints. Compared between tendon and ligaments, because ligaments have to be able to stretch as the joint bends, you're going to have a little higher ratio of elastin in the ligament than you will in the tendon that's just holding the muscle onto the bone. They each have a little bit of elastin, but again, we're going to alter the amount of protein and the type of protein to fine tune this particular tissue for the function it's serving. We're also going to see this type of very, very strong connective tissue forming the lowest layers of the skin, the dermis. And it's going to be arranged in sheets, but those sheets go in different directions. So it provides a real strong barrier to things. This is right underlying the epithelial cells that are also in the skin. Okay. The next two types of cells are related to each other, similar to how loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue was. Hyaline cartilage and bone. Cartilage is a type of cell shown here. This little red thing is the cell, and they live inside little chambers in the matrix. These are called lacuna. That means moon. So some of these are kind of moon shaped if you look at them very carefully. They are constantly secreting. Well, I take that back. In cartilage cells, when you're an embryo, they are constantly secreting a matrix. And remember, that's the definition of connective tissue, is that it's living cells living within a matrix. But the matrix that makes up cartilage is a very smooth glass-like structure. It has proteins in it, but also a lot of carbohydrates and lipids that form a rigid but very, very flexible and very, very smooth surface. So where are you going to find this? In between bones in a joint, because they prevent friction from forming. You also are going to see this in your earlobe. So if you grab your earlobe right now and move it around, you're actually moving cartilage. Also in your nose. So again, you got cartilage there. Your larynx. So if you feel there, the reason that can be collapsed is because it's fairly soft tissue known as cartilage. And you're also going to find this in the ribs that attach to your sternum that allow you to be able to expand your rib cage and contract your rib cage during breathing. So these have a specific function. It's rigid, much more rigid than dense connective tissue. And it's got a smooth surface to it, so it doesn't produce a lot of resistance or a lot of friction. But let's compare that to bone. Bone is living cells. Here, kind of these dark red things here are the individual bone cells that are called osteocytes. Osteo means bone and cyte means cell, so these are bone cells. This is an organ. So an organ contains all the different types of tissue. So there will be epithelial tissue, but the particular type of connective tissue that makes up the bone is what we're referring to here. And again, these are living cells living inside a matrix. These cells secrete collagen and elastin, just like all the other cells that we looked at, but they're also going to secrete calcium. And the calcium is going to harden together with phosphorus into a very, very sturdy mineral like concrete. And so this becomes therefore the structural component of the body, but it's a living system. These cells are constantly producing this material, which is why you can fracture a bone and it can be repaired. That also means it has to have constant nutrients coming to it. So the organ known as the bone is full of blood vessels. And also we need to control it. And it's not shown here, but there's also nervous system components coming here to regulate this. So all of these different types of tissue get combined into an organ. We're referring here to the particular structure of the bone known as compact bone as connective tissue. Cartilage and bone, therefore, are closely related to each other. The difference is their function, and the bone, of course, has an enormous amount of mineralized calcium. Let's look at another unique form of connective tissue called adipose tissue. Is connective tissue, well, cells within a matrix, but this matrix is kind of odd. The nuclei of the cell is found in these little dark purple spots. So these are the cells, the nuclei of what's called adipocytes. And this type of cell does really one thing and does it very, very well. It stores an enormous quantity of fat. This is important because we use fat for a storage of energy. We can convert fat back into glucose and then use it to make ATP. In between meals, and if we go weeks without meals, we can rely on fat stores to provide energy when we're not eating. But also, just as important of that, lining all your internal organs needs to be a layer of fat because it provides cushioning. Together with the fluid that's filling the body cavities, this will provide cushioning, and it will also provide insulation, thermal insulation, to help maintain body temperature. These are all roles of adipose tissue. There's other things that if you study kind of advanced physiology, this also becomes important because these cells do produce hormones, the hormones that are made from fats. They have a ready supply of producing hormones, therefore. Finally, we have a type of connective tissue that you may not think of as being tissue, but it's simply blood. Blood is composed of cells, red blood cells and white blood cells. We're going to talk about that in much more detail and talk about the circulatory system. But remember, the definition of connective tissue is that it's cells living within a matrix. Normally, we're talking about a matrix formed from collagen fibers and elastin fibers, sometimes mineralized with calcium, sometimes mostly lipids in adipose tissue. We still have a matrix that these cells are living in. It's called plasma, which is blood, or water filled with a bunch of electrolytes and other smaller proteins. So it has all the functions and properties of connective tissue. And it also has the property of connective tissue in that it supports other tissues and cells. And surely the circulatory system using blood is the epitome of supporting all the other cells in the body. So that's a quick summary of our different types of connective tissue. And this chart kind of summarizes that too. This is available in your PowerPoint slides. So let's get to just a brief discussion of the two remaining types of tissues that we're going to discuss in more detail later on in the semester. The first is muscle tissue. And the only thing I really want you to know right now is that it's unique to animals. It's not in all animals because sponges don't have this, but skeletal tissue has a particular structure to it where inside the cell, it's got proteins that are running in parallel to each other, and they are what's connected to the skeletal system to provide locomotion. So therefore, that's called skeletal muscle. We also have a very similar type of muscle that has a lot of parallel fibers inside of it too. Very, very specific function though is for cardiac muscle. It's different from skeletal muscle, but it's very similar to it. But it performs only one function, and that's to pump blood in the body. So we'll talk about that when we talk about the circulatory system. Finally, we have smooth muscle, which instead of providing locomotion and instead of being part of the heart, is found everywhere around internal organs. And it allows us to change the size of the ducts in internal organs to cause peristalsis, to do all sorts of things. So we're going to be talking about smooth muscle as we talk about the digestive system, respiratory system, and the urinary system. Okay. And then the last type of, just talk about the last type of tissue is the nervous tissue, which we'll talk about in the last couple of weeks of the semester in more detail. But we have two types of cells, two groups of cells. So neurons are the ones that use electricity to process information that we think of as forming, helping us form memories, senses. And then glial cells are kind of the connective tissue of the brain, because they nourish, they insulate, and they support the neurons. But they are part of the tissues that make up the entire nervous system. So we have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue, we have muscle tissue, and we have nervous tissue. So that's a summary of all the different types of tissues we have. Obviously, your textbook goes into more detail. So that's the end of this video. Our next video, we'll talk about homeostasis and thermoregulation. Cheers.